We are now coming to the panel discussion, which for those of you, who were here last year, is quite different to last year because we thought, it's less interesting, when Kristen is asking questions, and it's more interesting, when you are asking questions. So I think this is probably, from the quality of the speakers, the best panel that we ever had in all of the Medidata Next events. So I would like to open up the panel discussion, and I would like to ask you if you've got any questions to Glen, to Inhav, and to Achim. Any volunteers yet? I know the first one is always the hardest one.
Elin, you mentioned bring your own device, and I understood you're actually using bring your own device. A lot of companies mention it, but then actually struggle to implement it. So what did you do to make it usable?
Yeah, so we have experienced the same sort of validation issues that all the other companies are experiencing in the vast amount of different devices that are out there, and how can you really test all of them to be sort of compliant. I have to say I've started from a slightly different approach and really looked at the patient centricity point of view and thought, actually, if we really gonna walk the walk of the talk that we're doing, adapting to a bring your own device is something we have to do. Giving patients additional devices or parents additional devices when they're already struggling with day-to-day life and enough thing is kind of a step too far. And if we can't kind of find a way of integrating the technology into a handset that they're using on a day-to-day basis, then I think it's sort of more our problem than theirs. So we have got a sort of risk management process in our testing that we try and test the highest number of software or handsets devices that we can. And then we obviously then work on a bit of risk basis that when a patient is consented and seen to have a handset that's not within the ones that we've tested, then we can sort of consider giving them another one, or depending on the data collection and the accuracy point of view that's required from that handset, adapt to it that way. So, I come from a regulatory background. I understand the importance of validation and testing, but I sometimes think that patient centricity is even more important.
Thank you, Elin. Achim, is this on top of your mind as well in terms of supporting patients, with any devices, they would like to use?
It's, for us, it's less about the device. The device is at the end just a point of entry. It's more how can you, we call it patient-centric. I guess that's a big term, but at the end of the day, bringing the trial to the patient is something that is clearly very important for us, because we know how inconvenient it is to go to sites, and also when I saw your graph, it reminded me a lot of, yes, these point interventions don't make sense anymore. We want to have the data points at home ideally, and then continuously. And that also allows the patient to be, obviously more in a convenient state. So yes, decentralized trials, we call it. We also went into a few partnerships with a few companies there. Clearly a big trend for us to come.
Glen?
So we started, actually some people in the room probably know, we started with a bring your own device strategy around some of our patient cloud work. We wound up having to go into the option to provision. And actually, Anthony and I were just talking about it and reviewing data. We have more people who choose, patients who choose to have a device provision than not, which I found to be an interesting data point. From a regulatory perspective, from a scientific perspective, maybe this can be my controversial statement for the day. One day, I expect we're going to discover that those provision devices don't give us as good data as the bring your own device, because it is actually then part of what is in the natural fabric of patients' lives. And after that happens, the regulators will start to demand that. So it's a dial that we should probably be able to do both directions.
And if I may follow up on that, I've just been involved with an EMA qualification of a new digital biomarker, and it's always a bit of a chicken and egg sort of. Pharma companies will say, oh, well, we can't get regulators to accept this data, and regulators will say, well, pharma company, don't bring us this data to push our thinking and what we can accept. And our digital biomarker qualification procedure that we did was actually the first one that the EMA qualification had sort of really looked at in the way. So I agree that regulatory science is sometimes a bit slow to sort of catch up with emerging technologies, but I think there's an appetite on both sides of the pond now to look at it, and so the brave will be those that sort of the early adopters, and I sort of put it back to the sort of thing of a cargo ship. It's very slow to turn a corner, but once it's sort of turned and going full steam ahead, then there'll be no stopping it.
There's a question in the middle row here.
There's one back there too that we missed the first time.
Hi, Alistair Stewart from GSK, and thank you guys for three very interesting, enlightening presentations. Just to refer to one of Alan's points, I think about the endpoints we collect, particularly in pediatric studies, and how relevant they are to the children and to the patients, etc. I guess extrapolating that, one of the key needs of the industry is to deliver medicines as quickly as possible, reduce variability in studies, etc. So how do we match that with the heterogeneity of people? How do we go about better reflecting that people are different, and how can we use digital to help us do that?
So again, I'll kind of follow up on the controversial. I was so excited and enthusiastic when the pediatric regulation came to force, because I genuinely thought this was it. This was going to be the change in the pendulum that made safer and more efficacious medications for children. And slightly now I've been sort of disillusioned, I guess, that it didn't deliver on the promise that I'd personally hoped that it would. And part of that was that we were still using archaic clinical trial design and approaches and trying to use something that was just out of date into something like children that are constantly evolving every day. So I think one of the exciting opportunities now, there's a lot of work again about extrapolation, and if you combine the new extrapolation framework and if you combine the new sort of adaptive pathways approach, because actually what we need to do is follow these patients for 10, 15, 20 years, which is obviously not feasible in a clinical trial. But if we use emerging technology in an adaptive way and extrapolation from other diseases in a very data-driven way, I think it will provide us far more meaningful outcomes than trying to force a randomized placebo-controlled trial with an inappropriate endpoint on a rare disease or a pediatric population that's very heterogeneous. So I think, again, it's really time to change.
And if I could just add, I think that there's an interesting thing that should happen when people use the word digital. It's one of these sexy buzzwords that everybody likes to use today. Well, can it mean something substantive? And at least one of the things that I have as an expectation when I hear that from a clinical trial perspective is if I'm using something digital, there's very little incremental cost to collecting more data. So every time I do a Duchenne muscular dystrophy 6-minute walk test, right, which is just a ludicrous endpoint to be looking at on so many levels. But there's a cost to doing it, and it's not the most painful thing to do. We're putting the patient through an exercise, and we're paying the nurse to observe it. But if we could track activity of that patient, you wind up doing two things. You wind up with a much bigger set of data, which means that a lot of noise that you might find, because the patient did or didn't get ice cream that day, actually starts to drop out. And you can start to look at something very different than the distance between two discrete data points, which is changes in velocity, changes in the way activity curves move for different patients. I get asked a lot when we talk about adult activity, well, how do you know that the steps are all equivalent? And my answer is, I'm not convinced I need to care yet. No. We need to show that an endpoint is useful to determine an outcome. And I expect that we'll find things that don't matter in terms of what the accuracy of the step count is. We're just going to see trends, and the trends are important. We can't even find those trends in the staccato observations that we have in non-digital endpoints. So I have a lot of optimism, I think, that we share it in terms of how these things actually allow us to do a better job of catering to individuals and not relying on these kind of artificial frameworks.
Sorry, you'll have to tell me to shut up in a minute, but this is such a topic I think the other thing that's really important to consider, one of the things we faced, is that we are going to be asked to use these new endpoints, new digital blueprint, digital biomarkers, whatever sexy word you want to give them, and they'll say, yes, but can you correlate them to currently gold standards? Now, what do we do if they don't correlate to currently gold standards? It doesn't actually mean that the new endpoint that we're developing is wrong. It means that we're measuring different things. And that, I think, is going to be one of the things that we really need to try and also sort of think of how we're going to consider that, because correlating bad to bad does not allow us, I think you were talking about legacy, does not allow us to move forward.
Maybe just one word. I mean, this is all great. I just see sometimes our clinicians struggling with these new concepts for various reasons. A, because it requires a different thinking, also a different approach to a trial. But B, sometimes also it's simply, it doesn't follow the norm. And then, of course, a trial, the minute it goes into the big machine, it follows certain steps and procedures. But the minute then you think a little bit outside of the box, you add new data sets, you add readable data. We talked about ePro, for example, as well. It's just not always there yet. Yeah? So it takes a few big hits and a few successes, and I think that's also where companies like yours can make a big change in the industry, and I hope that we will see more of those.
There's a question in the back.
Zeshan, I'm from a company called Antidote. So the question I had for the panel was, why is it that in an industry which is so centered on scientific innovation, that this seems so divorced from technological innovation? There's almost a standing joke that innovation teams in pharma companies is where innovation goes to die. And do we see this changing over time? I mean, just to give you just a really trivial example, we went through a vendor qualification process with a pharma company who I won't name, I'll save them their blushes. And one of the questions on that process was, does your company make use of the internet? Which in this day and age, given that we're an online platform for matching patients to trials, seems like a somewhat absurd question, but it just highlights that many of these procedures, programs in place haven't changed probably in decades.
So let me defend the industry for a second and some of its conservatism. So if you're in a healthcare professional's role, you have a patient who you're treating, and you need to take very seriously the decisions you make because you have potentially the lives of a person in your hands. If you are developing a drug, even if it's for a rare disease, you have at least thousands, probably tens of thousands of people's lives in your hands if you do it right or wrong. If you're doing a vaccine, maybe literally on the order of a billion people's whose lives could be in your hands. So I think some of the conservatism that we have is healthy. That said, the world is changing very quickly, and I actually think the Novartis example is perfect. It's not really the technology that's the problem. It's lining up everybody and thinking about the framework that you're going to deploy it and how you scientifically make sure that you're setting yourself up to prove that you're doing a better job. And actually, I'll just use that endpoint example. I agree. Like the idea is not to show that something quantitative and objective is better than ECOG, which is largely qualitative and much lower resolution, but that you are producing a better outcome for the patients that you're serving. And a regulator's job, a good scientist's job, isn't just to say, hey, Glen, great idea, I believe you. It's right, to start with the null hypothesis. The new scale isn't going to work. The new drug doesn't work. And what is the framework? The new technology doesn't make it a better process. And what is the framework by which you prove to yourself and to others that it really made a difference? I actually think now I'll be on our side, all of our side. We are uniquely positioned to make those arguments and set up those proofs, because it's what we do with safety and efficacy every day. We just need to take the tools that we already know how to use and apply them to a different set of problems around technologies and markers and things like that.
I would agree. I mean, at the end, we're dealing with lives, so it's a sensitive business. Maybe that's also why, of course, we sometimes appear a bit more risk-averse than other industries. But so be it, and I think that's also for a good purpose. I think personally, I mean, I've been in this now for 17, 18 years in this type of world. it was in the past, it was extremely difficult to even get into the boardroom and have a conversation about technology. Now I can't even, I mean, it's too much almost. It's like anything is digital. But of course, all the buzzwords are there. And it's more now like keeping the herds together, making sure that we actually follow a proper strategy and don't go totally crazy, because then at some point we don't produce any more medicines. Yeah? I think the part here where we as an industry can do better, and I followed also here your presentation this morning, this concept of open source or open data, and also not thinking about ourselves but about the industry, at the end about the society. That's something where we still can do better. For example, opening up our trial data sets for, let's say, even academic use, I think is a great thing to do. But of course, you always need to also counter the risk and also see a little bit what you give away. But if we move more into this open source concept, I think for all of us it will be a better world, and for sure also we will find better innovation using technology in such a construct.
I think what we have seen over the past years is, from a technology standpoint, I think, we very much often forget, how much steps technology has done over the past couple of years. Just some years ago, we weren't talking about cloud computing, we weren't about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the amount of quantum leaps, who has happened over the past couple of years, are so immense, that it's now so much more relevant, than just a couple of years ago, I would say. And which is point one, and point two. So what we are seeing, when we specifically in Europe, are talking to regulators, they are really pushing for making use of all these things, of data science, of the use of technologies, building up things, that David had presented, building up scientific control groups. So these are all things, which weren't possible just a couple of years ago. I think, that's the main difference, and that's why we are so much more relevant than, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago.
There's one up here that we didn't get.
Hello, my name is Paul Fardy from Citel. At the moment, we're getting an influx of guidelines and regulations, particularly centered around, on the one hand, data transparency, and on the other hand, data privacy. Now, in a lot of our minds, these are kind of opposites, and provides some dichotomy of what we have to do in terms of protecting the patient, but also making it more transparent. So I'd like to understand your thoughts on, from a vendor perspective and from a sponsor perspective, how those can be aligned more easily perhaps, or how they can be treated in such a way that it makes it suitable to move forward in the platforms that you're offering.
So I agree that these are kind of forces in opposition. I think the unfortunate fact is most of the data privacy regulations that are being created are not being created with any intent to interfere with practicing better medicine or making better drugs. It just so happens that we're stuck in the crossfires and have to comply with them. I also think, on the other side, one of the things in our favor is that most of them are not absolute, in that it becomes impossible for people to share information. You just have to be very careful about making sure that you have the right permissions and people have the abilities to opt out of things later, et cetera. And we work in a world in trials where, depending on the therapeutic area, but depending on the study, there's almost always a degree of altruism in the volunteer. And they do want to share their data. They do want other people to benefit from them. So there are still going to be times that we have to walk the line in the middle, and that's where I think some of the technology and some of the statistical data science can help behind the scenes. We don't actually have to send everybody's discrete medical data items all over the world to share data in a productive scientific way. There are ways to de-identify and aggregate and transmit with enough information where it can be re-aggregated with other data to support that a new biomarker makes sense, or that a drug is usable in another indication, or that an NDA in its most basic form is one that can be looked at by a regulator with confidence that it's an accurate reflection of what's happening in the world. It's just layers of complexity that we need to add. But at least from the vendor perspective, I don't think that there's anything that we can't overcome. We just have to sensibly think through it and kind of plod through. Does that make sense?
I think verification is an approach that sort of will hopefully support some of those concepts too. It's obviously it's sort of a concept that it's in its early sort of, but I think, you know, with IMI now particularly, they're sort of really looking at this sort of verification thing as being a way that we have to be more open in sharing data for the value of all. And I think that's going back to the point that you just said. I think this is an area where all industry partners can genuinely collaborate for the good of all, and still retain their sort of competitive assets with it.
Yeah, I guess maybe I should rather say I have a more private opinion here, which is as a consumer these days, obviously, and as a European especially, I think these are good things if they serve a certain purpose and if they don't layer on just bureaucracy, but at the end really help to protect our own data. I still have my mom at home who turns off her Wi-Fi every night because she believes that somebody might break into her data that nobody cares about. But I guess that's the world we are in now. But I'm with you as well for some things, like maybe even GDPR. Maybe they hadn't had the patient in mind really, and they're not really advancing medicines. There I'm totally with you, but it's good. I think it's good that this topic is back on the table, because at the end of the day it belongs to us, and we have to be just more sensible about data.
Yeah. But also I think, you know, being in the UK and sort of living the effect of Brexit now, we could never imagine that Facebook data would be harvested and used by Cambridge Analytica in a way that was influencing the democracy process and the voting process in the UK the way that it was. And I think, you know, we have to be mindful that we have absolutely no idea how patient data may or may not become useful or used in the future. So, you know, while it is frustrating in some of the short terms, until we sort of get a better understanding, and I don't think, I mean, you're better placed than me to comment, but does anybody in the room actually know, how data of a patient will or will not be used for precision medicine and stuff like that in the future? And can we really trust that it won't end up being used against the patient in their hour of need? And so it's challenging, but I think the whole Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, Brexit, democracy incident has sort of made me even more mindful that we have a responsibility to be a guardianship of patient data, even if it means to be stifling innovation at times.
No, I agree. Actually, hopefully, in some way, maybe I don't sound too self-serving, but to our credit, we were, before the whole Cambridge Analytica thing came out and everything happened with Facebook, we've been talking about, obviously, data a lot at Medidata, and how is the industry going to evolve? And so you had these companies I talked about before who focused on co-location, and then companies who focused on magic algorithms, and people screwed those up. People are going to have sensible data strategies that get both of those, all those things in that thread right. So we were talking a lot about what is the next failed data strategy. And I think the next big frontier is trust. Because now the entire world, not just patients, but in every context, I think quite rightly so, because we have good empirical data to back it up, our default thought should be, my data is going to be used for something that I'm not aware of, or potentially I don't want to have happen. I find it hilarious to see a lot of my friends talk about things that are political through a medium which is responsible for making the things that they didn't want to happen. It's like, well, why are you posting there? So, but we still kind of do it by default, and I think there'll be this big societal shift, and it's not just going to be businesses interacting with consumers, it's going to be businesses acting with businesses, and whether you're a vendor, like us, whether you're a pharmaceutical company, you're going to need to be able to look your clients in the eye and have something to back up the fact that, yes, you can trust me, I am going to do with your data only what you have asked me to do with it, or that you want me to do with it. And I think society will have to figure out how we prove that.
Although in this last one, the trust topic, as a technologist, obviously I'm a big fan and believer in blockchain, and I do see a lot of potential there. In fact, even next week, I'm back here in London to talk with the EMA about blockchain and how we can enable some of these exchanges based on trusted technology. Let's see what the future will bring on that one. I'm sure at some point it will be on your roadmap too, because there is certainly, this might dissolve some of these trust and reputational issues that particularly exist in our industry.
Yeah, blockchain,
Sorry.
I'm so excited. I'm so excited to disagree with Achim.
I had to throw in a buzzword.
Yeah, but I think from a trust point of view, blockchain has some potential. But from a privacy and the patient's right to be forgotten, once it's on there,
Right, impossible.
If you say GPDR, I want my right to be forgotten, it's like, well, you're on blockchain now.
Right,
Good luck with that.
It's the perfect example because I've heard the answer to that. So I was talking about that exact context, and the person I was talking to said, "Oh, but every block in the blockchain is encrypted, and there's a key that the patient has." I said, "So how is this any different than a database?" And so I do think blockchain is a tool like natural language processing and artificial intelligence that has some really cool uses. But I also think it's buzzwordy right now.
It is a bit buzzwordy.
And
I had to throw it in.
Yeah. Look, this is my litmus test. If the business value description from like a startup blockchain healthcare company, if the word blockchain can be replaced by the word database and nothing is different, then it's being used as a buzzword, right? And I think there's a lot of those. There is, by the way, a secret group at Medidata that thinks I don't know they're working on a blockchain thing. I know.
We'll be back here next year.
All right, good. We've got space for one last question, and the option for 4 very, very short answers.
Hello, my name is Jörn Klinger from a small startup called Biotech AI. We do machine learning AI for healthcare, and so do you on a much larger scale. So how far do you think does that put you ahead of the curve? And we've seen in the keynote your kind of comprehensive platform. What aspects of the platform do you see more readily adopted, and what are things that will be implemented in the future, but maybe need a few more of these events to convince people, and why?
At least from my perspective, I mean, I do think that we're delivering a lot of stuff with actual artificial intelligence, machine learning, soon some neural network stuff actually incorporated into it in a very real way. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. So if there are clients who are using that functionality and getting value out of it, that makes me feel good about it. I certainly don't think that any of these things are proprietary to the point that the rest of the world won't be using it. It sounds like you're in the right space. I want my doctor to be looking at some machine learning-based set of recommendations when they're having a conversation with me about what I might do next about whatever condition I'm dealing with. I just think that's going to become part of the way every system works. I don't see a future where there's going to be kind of the transactional world and this world of artificial intelligence that's separate and magical. It'll just all get incorporated together. That's at least my perspective.
I think I'm probably not going to answer your question, but I think I'll try and finish on a controversial note just because
it's more fun.
That's kind of the person I am. I think what's really interesting, so I obviously spent 20 years as a civil servant, as a nurse, academic, regulator, and I've just moved to sort of the startup industry. And it's been a real cultural mind shift, a real sort of big change. And one of the things that's really struck me is the use of hype and gloss. And we sort of joke, but if you can add the word blockchain and AI into your startup portfolio, you double your valuation overnight. But actually, when you scratch beneath and say, well, what is your machine learning? What is your AI? And you just talked about blockchain. You realize that it's so much hype. And if there's one thing that I think will do more damage to innovation and this landscape as we try and move the needle, is this hype. Because I understand that people feel the need to do it for investment but I think this is going to be this huge dip of disillusionment first, where I'm hoping I'm wrong, but that we might be still here in 10 years' time talking about why are we still not there.
All the people failing will amplify the people who are actually doing something
yes,
useful.
And I think, but part of that, I think we need better, honest conversation about celebrating the failures in an open way, because I don't think we need to, let's share the risk and the rewards in equal measures. And so let's talk openly about our failures. What did did go wrong. And let's not gloss and hype words like blockchain and AI to get investment, but let's look more about where is the real thing. So I guess it's more of a finishing statement of can we balance the hype with a little bit of risk sharing, transparency.
Delivery.
And delivery, for sure.
Achim, any final words from your side?
So I'm sure you're going to laugh now because
I know that one of the panelists needs to catch a flight, so therefore we should end up with time here. Yeah.
That's me. That's me. So I'm sure you're going to laugh now because you will probably think that all our initiatives are named after movies, but here we have another one. So our AI machine learning initiative right now in my particular space is called Data 42, and data obviously for the data reason, and 42 because of
The answer's
Life, the universe, and everything.
and the life and everything. There you go, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And if you remember that movie, now we're back to movies, but it's the supercomputer. Obviously, it takes 2,000 years to come up with the answer, but the answer is not actually what you want. You want the right question. And that's also what we are trying to bring back to our teams is don't jump on the answer or even the technology just provides you the answer. Think about the right question. And there's so many variations of the right question, and you can get stuck in so many different subtleties if you don't ask the right question from the beginning. Any technology is just useless if you didn't ask the right question. So that's what we are trying to accomplish.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think that was a very, very good panel discussion, as expected. Thank you so much. And I would like to thank you. And we're coming to our last point of our morning agenda. You can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.